The quarterly shareholders' meeting at Thompson Manufacturing was always held in the same sterile conference room on the 15th floor. Same mahogany table, same leather chairs, same view of the industrial district where Dad had built his empire over 30 years. And always the same seating arrangement. The board members around the table, Dad at the head as CEO, and me in the corner chair with my laptop taking minutes. Administrative assistant. They called my position, though I'd been doing it for 6 years now since graduating from Stanford with my MBA. Dad had insisted I learn the business from the ground up, before considering any real role in company operations. The ground up apparently meant taking notes and keeping quiet during important discussions. Today's meeting was particularly tense. Thompson Manufacturing was facing its biggest decision in decades. Whether to accept a buyout offer from Meridian Industrial, a massive conglomerate that had been acquiring smaller manufacturing companies across the Midwest. The offer is substantial, announced Robert Chin, the board chairman and Dad's oldest business partner. Meridian is proposing $450 million for full acquisition. Board member Patricia Williams leaned forward. That's almost triple our current valuation. It's hard to ignore numbers like that. James Peterson, Dad's golfing buddy who'd been on the board for 15 years, nodded enthusiastically. We'd all walk away wealthy. Very wealthy. Dad, however, looked unconvinced. At 62, Thomas Thompson was still the formidable presence who'd built this company from a single machine shop into a major regional manufacturer. His thick gray hair was perfectly styled, his navy suit impeccable, and his expression skeptical. Meridian has a reputation for gutting the companies they acquire, he said firmly. They'll keep the contracts and the equipment, but they'll eliminate jobs. Half our workforce would be gone within a year. That's business, Tom, Peterson replied. We can't run a company based on sentiment. It's not sentiment, it's strategy, Dad countered. We've built something sustainable here. Thompson Manufacturing has been profitable for 28 consecutive years because we maintain quality and treat our people well. I continued typing, documenting every exchange while staying invisible in my corner. This was familiar territory, Dad's principled stance against what he saw as corporate raiders, the board's growing interest in cashing out, the tension between legacy and profit. What they didn't know was that I'd been analyzing Meridian Industrial for months. Not officially, of course. Nobody had asked the administrative assistant for strategic analysis. But I'd studied their acquisition patterns, financial statements, and post-merger performance data. Dad's instincts were correct. Meridian typically eliminated 30 to 40% of acquired workforce within 18 months while extracting maximum short-term value. The question, Robert Chin continued, is whether we want to remain a family business with limited growth potential, or take this opportunity to maximize shareholder value. Dad's jaw tightened. Limited growth potential? We've expanded our market share by 12% in the last 2 years. Regional market share, Williams corrected. Meridian offers national distribution, international contracts, economies of scale we could never achieve independently. At the cost of our independence and our workers' jobs. Peterson spread his hands diplomatically. Tom, I understand the emotional attachment. You built this company. But we have a fiduciary responsibility to shareholders. $450 million is more money than most of us ever dreamed of. That's when Dad made the mistake that would change everything. He stood up, commanding the room's attention with the authority that had made him successful for 3 decades. His voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. Gentlemen, he began, then paused and glanced at Williams. And lady, this decision requires serious business analysis, not emotional reactions to dollar signs. We need to think like experienced executives, not amateur investors. The room fell silent, waiting for his conclusion. Some of you might be swayed by Meridian's offer because it seems like easy money. But real business decisions require understanding market dynamics, competitive positioning, long-term value creation. His eyes swept the room with obvious confidence. These are complex concepts that require years of operational experience to fully grasp. Then he looked directly at me, sitting quietly with my laptop, and delivered the words that would end his control of the company he'd spent 30 years building. Leave business to the men, he declared with absolute authority. Women don't understand manufacturing. The board members chuckled, a mixture of nervous agreement and habitual deference to Dad's pronouncements. Even Williams, the only other woman in the room, managed a tight smile that suggested she'd learned to pick her battles carefully. I sat quietly, fingers poised over my keyboard, and continued taking notes. The meeting progressed through financial reports, operational updates, and preliminary voting procedures. Dad outlined his vision for continued independence, emphasizing employee loyalty, community relationships, and sustainable growth. It was a compelling presentation, delivered with the passion and expertise that had made him successful. The board listened respectfully, asked thoughtful questions, and seemed genuinely torn between sentiment and profit. What none of them realized was that Dad had just made the most expensive comment of his career. When the formal meeting concluded 2 hours later, board members began filing out, discussing dinner plans and golf schedules. Dad was gathering his papers, still confident in his ability to convince them that independence was the right choice. That's when Robert Chin approached my corner table, where I was closing my laptop and organizing my notes. "Miss Thompson," he said quietly, "could I speak with you for a moment?" I looked up, expecting some administrative request about meeting minutes or scheduling. "Of course, Mr. Chin." The remaining board members had paused their conversations, sensing something unusual in Chen's tone. Dad looked over with mild curiosity, probably wondering what administrative detail required the chairman's attention. Chen's next words changed everything. "As majority owner of Thompson Manufacturing," he said clearly, "what are your instructions regarding the Meridian Industrial Acquisition proposal?" The silence in that room was absolute. Dad's expression didn't just freeze, it shattered. The confident authority he'd displayed throughout the meeting disappeared, replaced by complete bewilderment. "Majority owner?" he repeated slowly. I closed my laptop and stood up, meeting Chen's eyes directly. "I'd like to schedule a special board meeting to discuss strategic alternatives. Meridian's offer deserves careful consideration, but we should explore all options before making a final decision." Peterson was looking back and forth between me and Dad like he was watching a tennis match played by invisible players. "I'm sorry, what's happening here?" Williams had gone pale. "Robert, what do you mean majority owner?" Chin opened his briefcase and removed a folder of documents. "Ladies and gentlemen, I believe there's been some confusion about the company's ownership structure. Ms. Catherine Thompson currently holds 51% of Thompson Manufacturing's shares." Dad found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "That's impossible." "Actually, it's quite well documented," Chin replied, distributing copies of share certificates and transfer documents. "The majority position was accumulated over 6 years through a series of carefully structured purchases." I watched Dad scanning the documents, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and growing comprehension. Each page confirmed what Chin was telling them. I owned controlling interest in Thompson Manufacturing. "How?" Dad managed. It was a fair question. How does an administrative assistant acquire 51% of a major manufacturing company without anyone noticing? The answer was simpler than they'd expect and more complex than they could imagine. It had started during my senior year at Stanford, when I'd written my MBA thesis on family business succession planning. My research had focused on companies where ownership and management became separated over time, often without founders realizing the shift was occurring. Thompson Manufacturing had been my case study. Dad had incorporated the company 30 years ago, issuing shares to raise capital for expansion. Over the decades, as the business grew and needed additional funding, he'd continued issuing stock to investors, banks, and business partners. The company had thrived, but Dad had gradually diluted his own ownership from 100% to about 35%. He'd never worried about maintaining majority control because the remaining shares were spread among dozens of small investors. No single entity held more than 3 or 4%. Dad controlled the board, ran daily operations, and made all strategic decisions. Majority ownership seemed irrelevant. What he hadn't anticipated was someone systematically acquiring those scattered minority positions. I'd started 6 years ago, immediately after joining the company. My first purchase had been a 2% stake from Mr. Anderson, a retiree who'd invested early and wanted to liquidate for his grandchildren's college funds. Then 3% from the Peterson Family Trust when James needed cash for his son's medical bills. 1% from former employee Sarah Martinez when she started her own business. Small transactions spread over years, purchased through a private investment entity I'd established. Never enough to trigger disclosure requirements or raise suspicions. Each seller was happy to get cash for shares in a regional manufacturing company they barely understood. By my third year at Thompson Manufacturing, I own 19%. By my fifth year, 42%. Last month, I'd purchased the final 9% from 3 different estate sales, pushing my holdings to 51%. Majority control of the company where I worked as an administrative assistant, taking notes and staying quiet during board meetings. The share purchases were all properly documented and filed, Chin continued, still addressing the stunned board members. Ms. Thompson has been the majority owner for approximately 6 weeks. Dad was staring at the documents like they might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. Catherine, where did you get the money for this? Another fair question. Acquiring 51% of a company valued at $150 million required substantial capital. Approximately $77 million over 6 years. I started with the trust fund Grandpa Thompson established, I explained. $22 million when I turned 25. I invested it carefully, focused on growth, and used the returns to fund additional investments. Dad's father had been a successful real estate developer who died when I was 15. His trust had been substantial, but everyone had assumed I'd use it for personal expenses rather than business acquisitions. The investment returns were sufficient to fund the share purchases, I continued, along with some leverage from banks that were happy to lend against Thompson Manufacturing equity. What I didn't mention was that my investment success had been exceptional. Starting with Grandpa's $22 million, I'd built a portfolio worth over $200 million. Thompson Manufacturing represented about 40% of my holdings. I'd learned from some of the best minds in business. Stanford professors, investment mentors, and 6 years of listening to board meetings where strategic decisions were discussed in detail. I'd understood market dynamics, competitive positioning, and long-term value creation before I'd ever set foot in Thompson Manufacturing. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Dad had been explaining that women didn't understand manufacturing, I'd been quietly acquiring his life's work. Peterson found his voice first. So when we vote on the Meridian acquisition, Ms. Thompson's 51% constitutes majority control, Chin confirmed. The decision is ultimately hers. Williams was studying the share certificates with professional interest. This is remarkable strategic planning. How long have you been working toward majority ownership? It wasn't originally the goal, I admitted. I started investing in the company because I believed in its long-term potential. The majority position was a natural result of continued acquisition over time. Dad was still processing, his expression cycling through emotions I'd never seen him display. Catherine, why didn't you tell me? I considered the question carefully. When would have been the appropriate time? During family dinners when you explained that I needed to learn the business from the ground up? During board meetings when you emphasized the importance of keeping family business decisions within appropriate hierarchies? Or perhaps during today's meeting, when you explained that women don't understand manufacturing? The board members were exchanging glances that suggested they were recalculating everything they thought they knew about Thompson Manufacturing's power structure. Chin cleared his throat diplomatically. Perhaps we should schedule a special meeting to discuss the Meridian proposal in light of this new information? Agreed, I said. I'd also like to review our current strategic plan, market positioning, and growth opportunities. There may be alternatives to acquisition that we haven't fully explored. Dad was gathering his papers with movements that seemed automatic, his mind clearly elsewhere. Catherine, we need to talk. Privately. Of course. But first, I'd like to make sure everyone understands the immediate situation. I looked around the table at faces that ranged from shocked to calculating to genuinely curious. I have no intention of making dramatic changes to company operations. Dad has built something remarkable here, and I respect both his expertise and his vision. But, Peterson prompted, sensing there was more. But strategic decisions going forward will be made collaboratively, with input from all stakeholders, including perspectives that might not have been considered in previous discussions. Williams was smiling now, the first genuine expression I'd seen from her all afternoon. Including perspectives from women who allegedly don't understand manufacturing? I returned her smile. Among others. The meeting broke up with arrangements for a follow-up session the next week. Board members left in small groups, their conversations urgent and speculative. Chin lingered to discuss administrative details and transition procedures. Finally, Dad and I were alone in the conference room where I'd spent 6 years taking notes and staying quiet. Majority owner, he said, testing the words. 51%, I confirmed. And you never mentioned this because? I looked out the window at the factory floor below, where 237 people worked jobs that Dad had created and I now controlled. Because every time I've tried to contribute to strategic discussions, I've been reminded that my role is administrative support, not business leadership. Dad followed my gaze to the manufacturing floor. I was protecting you. This industry is tough, demanding. I wanted you to understand the challenges before taking on real responsibility. I've been studying the challenges for 6 years. Market analysis, competitive intelligence, operational efficiency, workforce management. I understand them quite well. By taking notes in meetings, I turned back to face him. By listening carefully, asking the right questions and doing considerable research on my own time. Also by acquiring first-hand experience with strategic investment, capital allocation and business development. Dad was quiet for a long moment, processing implications that extended far beyond corporate ownership. $200 million portfolio? Approximately. At 31 years old? 28 when I started with Grandpa's trust fund. It's been a learning experience. He laughed suddenly, a sound that mixed admiration with disbelief. You've been sitting in meetings letting me explain basic business concepts while you controlled my company. I've been listening to your explanations and learning from your expertise while building complementary skills you weren't aware I possessed. Dad shook his head slowly. What happens now? It was the right question. What did happen when the administrative assistant turned out to be the majority owner? When the daughter who'd been learning the business from the ground up was revealed to already be at the top. Now we work together, I said. You have operational expertise I need. I have strategic resources you can use. Meridian's offer is interesting, but it's not our only option. What other options? I opened my laptop and pulled up a presentation I'd been developing for months, waiting for the right moment to share it. Regional expansion, international partnerships, vertical integration opportunities. Thompson Manufacturing is positioned for significant growth, but it requires capital investment and strategic vision. Dad looked at the first slide, then at me. You've been planning this. I've been preparing for opportunities. Today's meeting created one. Over the next 2 hours, I walked Dad through a comprehensive growth strategy that would double Thompson Manufacturing's revenue within 5 years while maintaining the workforce stability and quality standards he valued. It was ambitious, well-researched, and entirely feasible with proper funding and execution. By the time we finished, Dad was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not the protective paternalism that had defined our relationship for 6 years, but genuine professional respect. When did you become smarter than me? He asked. I didn't. I became differently smart than you expected. Dad gathered his papers one more time, but his movements were thoughtful rather than automatic. The board meeting next week is going to be interesting. Very. And the Meridian decision? I closed my laptop, considering the question that would define Thompson Manufacturing's future. We'll evaluate all options objectively and make the choice that's best for stakeholders. All stakeholders. Including the 237 people on the factory floor? Especially them. Walking to the parking garage, I reflected on the afternoon's revelation. 6 years of careful planning had culminated in a moment that changed everything and nothing. I was still Catherine Thompson, still committed to the company's success, still respectful of Dad's expertise. But I was no longer the quiet administrative assistant taking notes in the corner. I was the majority owner with 51% control and a $200 million investment portfolio, ready to prove that women could understand manufacturing quite well when given the opportunity. Sometimes the best business strategy was patience. And sometimes, it was simply refusing to accept other people's limitations on your potential. The next board meeting was going to be very different indeed.